The star should not have been flickering. Naya Okafor noticed it first, the way she noticed everything that didn't fit. A half-second stutter in the light curve of a G-type star 400 million kilometers off the ashfall's bow. Gone before she could blink. She almost dismissed it as a sensor glitch. Almost. But the ashfall had been running on failing sensors, a failing hull, and a failing reactor for 6 weeks, and Naya had learned not to trust any explanation that let her stop worrying. "Captain," she said, "you need to see this." Priya Rao didn't look up from the NAV console right away. She was 3 days without real sleep, running calculations on how much longer they could push the engines before something critical melted, and the answer kept coming back: not long enough. Behind them, 70 hours out now and closing, the Directorate War fleet that had chased the ashfall out of the Kestrel belt was still coming, patient as erosion. "If it's not the fleet, it can wait," Priya said. "It's the star we're about to fly past." It flickered. That got her attention. Stars didn't flicker. Not real ones, not on any timescale a human eye could register. Priya pulled up the feed and watched the loop Naya had isolated. A bare eighth of a second where the star's light had dimmed by nearly a third, then snapped back as if nothing had happened. "Could be a transiting object," Priya said, already knowing that wasn't it. A transiting object wouldn't cause a dip that clean, that total, gone that fast. "I ran the numbers 3 times. Naya's voice had the flat calm she used when she was trying not to sound afraid. "Captain, whatever passed in front of that star was moving faster than anything should be able to move. Or it wasn't in front of the star at all. It was inside it." The bridge went quiet except for the tired hum of a ship that had seen better decades. "Define inside," said Tomas Alunga, unfolding himself from the engineering console where he'd been half asleep with a wrench still in his hand. He was the ashfall's chief engineer and the reason the ship was still flying at all. A big unhurried man who treated crises the way other people treated Tuesdays. "I mean, the star's surface has structure," Naya said. "There's something underneath the photosphere. Something solid." Priya looked at the dying readouts of her ship, then at the star on the screen, burning exactly the way a star was supposed to burn, giving nothing away. "Plot a course past it," she said. "Not through. Past. Far enough to get a better look. Close enough that the Directorate has to follow us if they want to keep the chase honest." "You want to use a star as bait," Tomas said. "I want to use a mystery as bait," Priya said. "The Directorate's not going to fly a war fleet into something they can't explain. They'll hold back to study it first. That buys us time we don't have any other way to buy." It was not, she would think later, an unreasonable plan. It was also not remotely what happened. There were 4 of them left on the ashfall, down from a crew of 11. The others had scattered across 3 separate escapes over the past 2 years, some dead, some simply gone, choosing safer ships or quieter lives once it became clear that hauling salvage out of contested space was going to keep getting more dangerous rather than less. Priya had stopped blaming any of them for leaving. She'd started, more recently, wondering how much longer she could justify not doing the same. The ashfall wasn't a warship and had never pretended to be one. It was a converted or hauler, built for slow, unglamorous work in systems nobody else wanted, and it had only ended up in Directorate crosshairs because of cargo Priya still wasn't entirely sure had been worth the risk. A shipment of pre-war data cores, salvaged from a dead colony, that a buyer in neutral space had paid absurdly well for and asked no questions about. She told herself at the time that the money would buy the crew a real retirement, a way out of the work before the work finally killed one of them. Instead, it had turned the ashfall into a target, and the crew that remained were the ones who'd decided, for reasons Priya still didn't fully understand, that staying with her was worth the risk of dying for it. "You're doing the face again," Tomas said. Not looking up from the engine diagnostics he'd been running for the better part of an hour, trying to squeeze another day's life out of a reactor that had earned its retirement 3 systems ago. "What face?" "The one where you're doing math on how much of this is your fault." "It is my fault," Priya said. "I took the cargo. I didn't ask enough questions." "You took the cargo because none of us could afford another 6 months of empty hulls, and every one of us signed off on it," Tomas said. "You want to carry guilt, carry the parts that are actually yours. There's usually less of it than people think, once you sort it properly." She hadn't had an answer for that then, and she still didn't have 1 hour later, watching the false red glow of the coal sack ember grow on the forward display. But she found herself thinking about it again once the star started behaving like nothing in the universe had any right to behave, because it turned out there was something almost restful about a mystery large enough to make her own guilt feel small by comparison. The star's name in the old charts was a string of numbers nobody used anymore. The scattering of independent traders and salvagers who worked this stretch of dead space called it the coal sack ember, because from a distance its light had a faint reddish cast that no G-type star should have had. Nobody had ever gotten close enough to explain why. The region around it was littered with debris in long, decaying orbits. Wreckage old enough that its metal had oxidized down to structures barely recognizable as ships. As the ashfall closed the distance, that wreckage stopped looking like the ordinary graveyard of a dangerous system and started looking like something else. "Tomas," Priya said, staring at the sensor sweep. "How many wrecks?" He didn't answer right away because he was doing the same thing she was, counting then recounting because the number kept climbing. "Passing 200, he said. "They're not random. Look at the distribution." The wrecks weren't scattered like debris from a battle or a disaster. They were arranged in loose concentric shells around the star, thinning out toward the edges, dense near the center. Ships from a dozen visibly different design philosophies. Angular, organic, segmented, some built from materials the ashfall spectrometer couldn't identify at all. All of them drawn to the same point and all of them, without exception, dead. "It's a graveyard," Naya said. "Everyone who's ever come here has died here. Or been stopped here," Tomas said. "There's a difference." Priya didn't like either option, but Tomas's version was worse, because it meant something was still doing the stopping. The Directorate fleet was 6 hours behind them now, close enough that Priya could see individual ship signatures on long-range scan, far enough that they hadn't opened fire. They wouldn't, not yet. Naya had been right about that much. The strangeness of the star had made even a war fleet cautious. But caution wouldn't last. Sooner or later the Directorate commander would decide the mystery was less important than the kill, and when that happened the ashfall, with its ruined engines and its skeleton crew, would not survive what came next. Which left one option that was almost worse than being caught, and that Priya found herself considering anyway: go somewhere the Directorate wouldn't dare follow. "Take us in," she said. "Close as the hull will hold." Up close, the coal sack ember stopped looking like a star at all. The photosphere was there, roiling and burning exactly as expected. But beneath it, visible only when the ashfall's deep spectrum sensors punched through the plasma noise, was a lattice. Vast, geometric, deliberate, a structure of interlocking rings and spars, built at a scale that made the ship carrying the sensors feel like a single cell drifting past the wall of an unimaginably large body. The star was not a star. It was a shell of controlled fusion, a skin of fire wrapped around something built. "It's hollow," Naya said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word, not from fear exactly, but from the vertigo of having a fact that large land on her all at once. "The whole thing is hollow. There's a structure inside holding the fusion shell together from the inside out. That's, Captain, that's not physics we have. That's not physics anyone should have." "Anyone we've met," Tomas corrected quietly. On the debris shells, the wreckage told a story now that the crew could half read. The ships closest to the star's surface, the oldest and most decayed, were also the most intact, as if whoever built them had gotten close and simply stopped, powered down, drifted. Farther out, the wrecks were more violent, torn apart, weapons discharged, hulls breached from the inside, as if later visitors had panicked or fought something or fought each other. "Everyone who tries to leave dies harder than everyone who tries to go in," Tomas said, working through the pattern out loud. "That's backwards from every trap I've ever heard of." "Unless it's not a trap," Priya said. "Unless it's a test and most people fail on the way out, not the way in." She didn't know where that thought came from, only that once she'd said it, it settled into place like something true. A single opening in the fusion shell resolved on their sensors as they came closer. Not a wound, not damage, but a deliberate gap in the lattice, wide enough for a ship the ashfall's size to pass through, edged with the same geometric structure as the rest of the shell, glowing faintly gold instead of stellar red. There was no way to know what waited on the other side. There was no way, anymore, to turn back. The Directorate fleet had closed to 2 hours out and had stopped pretending to be cautious. Weapons signatures were spinning up on the lead ships. "Captain," Naya said. "Orders." Priya looked at the opening, an invitation or a mouth, and thought about 7 weeks of running, and a crew that trusted her past the point where trust made sense, and a ship that had maybe one more hard maneuver left in it before something in the hull gave way for good. "Take us in," she said again. And this time it meant something different than it had 6 hours ago. The inside of the hollow sun was not fire. It was not, in fact, anything the HFY sensors had a category for. The ship passed through the gap in the fusion shell, and the plasma noise cut out all at once, replaced by a vast internal dark lit by threads of gold structure running along a spherical inner surface so large the ship's instruments needed almost a full minute to finish mapping its curve. There was gravity, real, steady, pulling toward the shell itself rather than any central point, which told Tomas immediately that whatever generated it wasn't behaving like mass at all. And there were more wrecks, thousands of them, drifting inside the shell, undisturbed by any wind or current, preserved in the total stillness of a space with no atmosphere to erode them and, apparently, nothing alive to loot them. "This is a mausoleum," Naya whispered, and nobody corrected her. She pulled the nearest wreck into close focus anyway, some habit of long practice refusing to let unfamiliar hulls pass unexamined. It was slender and segmented, its markings worn but still faintly visible, and there was no damage anywhere on it. No scorching, no breach, nothing that suggested a fight. Simply hung there, powered down, exactly where it had stopped. She cycled through 3 more wrecks and found the same thing each time. Different designs, different eras by the look of their corrosion, and every one of them intact, as if their crews had come this far and simply chosen to stop rather than been forced to. "They didn't die trying to leave," she said quietly. "They died staying, like they got close enough to see something and just froze. Or were stopped," Priya said. "Gently enough that it doesn't look like an attack. That's worse, in a way. A fight you can prepare for." At the center of the sphere, where a star's core would have been if the star had been real, hung a structure unlike anything else in the space. Smaller than the wrecks around it, elegant in a way that felt deliberate rather than functional, built from the same gold-threaded material as the shell. It pulsed, slow and steady, like something with a heartbeat. The HFY's comm system activated on its own. Before the voice spoke, the HFY was tested. It happened without warning. 3 golden threads of light detaching from the inner shell and sweeping toward the ship in formation, moving with a precision that made Naya's stomach drop before her instruments even finished registering the threat. She'd flown through minefields laid by 3 different navies in her career, and none of them had moved with this kind of unhurried certainty. Not the frantic evasive patterns of a weapon trying to catch something, but the calm geometry of something that already knew exactly where the HFY would be. "Evasive," Priya said, though she already suspected it wouldn't matter. Naya threw the ship into a hard bank anyway, the HFY's overtaxed engines screaming a protest that Tomas felt in his teeth before he heard it in the readouts. The threads adjusted, unbothered, folding around the ship's new heading as easily as they'd tracked the old one. For 3 long seconds, nobody breathed. Then the threads simply stopped, hovering a bare few meters off the hull, and did nothing at all. "They're not attacking," Tomas said, staring at the readout like it might change its mind. "They matched every evasion instantly and then just held position. That's not an intercept. That's a demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" Naya asked, voice tight. "That it could have killed us any time it wanted," Priya said slowly, understanding arriving with the particular chill of a threat that had already passed. "And chose not to. Hold your position, Naya. Don't run from something that already proved it doesn't need to chase." The threads lingered a moment longer, as if weighing that decision, and then withdrew, coiling back into the vast lattice of the inner shell as smoothly as they'd emerged. Whatever had judged them, it seemed, had judged the stillness that followed the demonstration as carefully as the demonstration itself. "You are the 4002nd vessel to enter this space," a voice said, translated into flawless directorate standard by systems Priya hadn't authorized and couldn't override. The voice was not warm and not cold. It had the affectless patience of something that had said the same words more times than it could count and had stopped expecting them to matter. 4001 have failed to leave. State your purpose." "We didn't come here on purpose," Priya said. because it was the truth and she didn't have the energy left to be clever. We're being hunted. We came here to survive. That is what the last one said as well, the voice replied. And the one before that. Survival is the purpose of every species that finds this place. It is, without exception, insufficient. Insufficient for what? Tomas asked. To leave. The line went dead, not disconnected, Priya realized, but simply finished, as if the voice considered the exchange complete and saw no reason to elaborate further. Behind the ashfall, the gap in the fusion shell they'd entered through was still open. Priya checked, twice, in growing dread, and confirmed what she already suspected. The Directorate fleet had stopped at the shell's edge and was holding position, unwilling to follow. They wouldn't have to. If 4001 ships had entered this place and failed to leave, the Directorate could simply wait outside as long as it took. Options, Priya said, mostly to herself. We could try to leave right now, Naya offered, though she didn't sound like she believed it. Test whether failed to leave means killed, or trapped, or something else. 4001 ships, Tomas said. We are not the first crew smart enough to think of trying that first. He was right, and it settled the matter. Whatever this place wanted, it wasn't going to be avoided by cleverness that every one of the 4001 dead ships had surely tried first. Then we do the thing nobody else did, Priya said. We ask what it actually wants, and we listen to the answer instead of trying to outthink it. She opened the comm channel herself this time. You said survival is insufficient, she said. Insufficient for what test? What are you actually asking us to do? There was a pause, the first pause the voice had allowed itself, and Priya let herself hope that meant something, that this was a new question in 4002 attempts. You are the first to ask, the voice said, and something in its flat patience had shifted, just slightly, into something that might have been surprise. Every other vessel assumed the purpose and pursued it. Warriors assumed conquest. Scholars assumed knowledge. Believers assumed communion. None asked. All failed because the assumption itself was the failure. So tell us, Priya said. What's the actual purpose? This structure was built to hold the last true record of every civilization that has died in this galaxy, the voice said. Their histories, their arts, their errors, their griefs. All of it preserved, so that nothing intelligent is ever forgotten entirely. It was sealed against those who would take that record and use it as a weapon or a trophy or a tool of domination. It opens only for those who would take it as a responsibility instead. And the 4001 who failed wanted the record for themselves. Every one of them, in the end, tried to seize it rather than earn it. Tomas exchanged a look with Priya. It was the kind of story that sounded noble and also sounded, if you turned it slightly, like the exact kind of trap a hoarder would build to justify never sharing anything at all. How do we earn it, then? Priya asked. What's the test? You are already taking it, the voice said, and the gold threads along the inner shell flared, all at once, into brilliant light. The next several minutes did not feel like a test. They felt like a system failure. Every screen on the Ashfall's bridge lit with cascading data, schematics, histories, languages, star charts stretching back further than any human archive. The accumulated memory of civilizations whose names had no equivalent in any human tongue. It came too fast to process, an ocean poured into a cup, and Priya watched Naya's hands freeze on her console, watched Tomas take an involuntary step back from the engineering display, both of them staring at information that was, in its raw totality, simply too large for a human mind to hold. Turn it off, Naya said, voice tight. Captain, this is going to break something. It's not, we can't. I can't turn it off, Priya said, because she'd already tried every command she knew, and none of them had done anything. The Ashfall's systems weren't fighting the download. They were welcoming it, expanding to make room for it in ways that made no engineering sense, ways that suggested the ship itself was being changed by what was pouring into it. This is what killed the others, Priya thought with sudden, cold clarity. Not violence. Not a trap in the conventional sense. Just this, an offer too large to survive accepting, for 1001 crews drowned in a flood of history they'd been told was theirs to take. Stop, she said aloud, to the star, to the voice, to whatever was listening. Stop the download. Right now. The flood halted, midstream, gold light freezing along the shell. You are refusing the record, the voice said, and there was something in its tone now that was almost like disappointment, for 1,002 attempts finally showing its age. I'm refusing to let it kill my crew, Priya said. You told us the ones who failed tried to seize the record for themselves. That's not what almost just happened. We didn't seize anything. You handed us everything at once, all in a rush, like you were testing whether we'd grab it or drown in it. But you never gave us a choice to take it slowly. That's not a fair test. That's just a faster version of the same trap. The pause this time was longer. Explain, the voice said. Priya looked at Naya, whose hands had started shaking on the console, and at Tomas, who had gone very still in the particular way he went still when he was furious and trying not to show it. And she understood, all at once, something the voice apparently hadn't considered in 4,001 prior attempts. You built a test to catch people who wanted to steal history, she said. But you never built a way for anyone to decline the flood and still pass. Every civilization that's ever come here that valued caution over greed, the ones who would have made good custodians, the ones who'd have said, this is too much, give it to us slower, give it to us carefully. You drowned them the same as the thieves. You've been killing the exact people you were looking for. The silence that followed was not the flat, patient silence of before. It had a different quality, something closer to the silence of a person realizing very late that they had made a mistake too large to easily name. I did not build this test, the voice said finally, and for the first time it did not sound like a machine reciting policy. It sounded, unmistakably, like someone confessing. I built this prison, and I have been telling myself, for longer than your species has existed, that the deaths outside are the fault of the greedy and never of the design. The gold structure at the center of the vast hollow space began, slowly, to unfold. What emerged from it was not a machine and not quite a body, a form built of the same threaded gold material as the shell, humanoid only in the loosest sense, shifting slightly at its edges as if it hadn't held a fixed shape in longer than it could remember. I am what remains of the species that built this place, it said, no longer routed through the ship's comm but audible directly, somehow on the bridge itself, a presence rather than a transmission. We were the last custodians of the galaxy's dying histories, and when our own civilization began to die, I chose to seal myself inside this shell with the record, rather than let it be lost or stolen. I built the test to keep the record safe from those who would misuse it. I did not build a way out for myself because I did not intend to need one. I intended to die here eventually, once I had found successors worthy of what I carried. How long have you been waiting? Priya asked quietly. Long enough that I stopped counting in years and started counting in the deaths of visitors, it said. 4,001. I told myself each failure proved the necessity of the test. I did not let myself consider that the test itself might be the thing failing. You are the first to refuse the flood rather than drown in it or run from it, and in refusing you have done something none of the others managed. You have made me look at what I built instead of simply defending it. Naya, who had spent the last several minutes staring at the drifting wrecks outside the bridge viewport rather than at the gold figure addressing them, finally spoke. Did you know their names? She asked. The 4,001. Did you learn who they were, or did they just become a number to you somewhere around the 100th death? The question landed harder than Priya expected it to, and harder, clearly, than the custodian had expected either. The gold light along its form dimmed slightly, the closest thing to flinching it seemed able to do. I knew every name, it said. I know all 4,001 in whatever language they called themselves, and I have kept a record of each death separately from the archive itself, because I could not let myself file them alongside the histories I was meant to be protecting. That would have made them part of the collection instead of a cost. I did not want to forget that they were a cost. Then you knew? Naya said, quieter now, some of the edge gone out of her voice. You knew it wasn't working. You just kept doing it anyway, because stopping would have meant admitting all of that was for nothing. Yes? The custodian said, without argument, without softening it. That is precisely what I did. I do not have a better answer than that. I do not think there is one. Tomas found his voice next, still edged with anger he wasn't fully suppressing. 4,001 crews, he said. That's not a test. That's a graveyard with extra steps. Yes, the being said, without defensiveness, without excuse. I know that now. I have known it, I think, for longer than I let myself admit. Guilt is easier to carry when it is dressed as necessity. So what happens now? Priya asked. We refused the flood. Did we pass? Or did we just find a new way to fail? You passed, it said. Not because you accepted the record whole the way I intended, but because you were willing to tell me the intention itself was wrong. That is worth more than acceptance. It is worth more, I think, than everything I built this place to test for. The gold light along the shell dimmed to something softer, steadier, no longer flooding the ashfall systems but simply present, waiting. I can give you the record properly now, it said. Slowly, as much as your ship and your minds can hold in a single visit, with the rest held here for you to return to at whatever pace you choose. That was always what should have been offered. I am sorry it took 4,001 failures and one crew willing to argue with me before I understood that. Priya thought of the Directorate fleet waiting outside the shell, patient as erosion, and of the ashfall's dying engines, and of everything they still didn't know about what they'd found. Before we take anything, she said, I need to know what happens to you. You said you sealed yourself in here to guard this. If we leave with even part of the record, does that mean you're free? Or does it mean you're finally allowed to die? The gold figure went very still. No one has asked me that either, it said. They talked for what the ashfall's chronometer measured as 11 hours. Though inside the hollow sun, with no true day or night, it felt like both a single unbroken moment and something that had lasted years. The being it gave eventually something like a name, though it admitted the sounds of it didn't survive translation cleanly, and Priya found herself simply thinking of it as the custodian, explained what 4,000 years of solitary guardianship had done to a mind built for companionship and shared purpose. It had not been designed to be alone. Its species had built the archive as a collective act, a promise passed between many hands, and the custodian had been meant to be relieved, eventually, by others of its kind who had died before that relief could come. You've been guarding this by yourself the entire time, Naya said, and there was something in her voice that had moved past fear into something gentler. That's not a caretaker. That's a life sentence you gave yourself for a crime that wasn't yours. I did not think of it as a sentence, the custodian said. I thought of it as duty. It is difficult from the inside of a duty that large to tell the difference. What do you want? Priya asked, and she meant it as plainly as she could manage. Not what the test required. Not what the record demanded. What the custodian itself actually wanted after 4 millennia of asking that question of everyone but itself. The answer, when it came, was quiet enough that the bridge's systems almost failed to register it. I want to stop being the only one who remembers, it said. I want the record to matter to someone besides me. I want very much to not be alone in this anymore, whatever that costs. Outside the shell, the Directorate fleet's patience finally broke. Long-range sensors caught the first spike of a weapons charge building on the lead cruiser, not an attack on the shell itself, which their scans had presumably told them was doing something they couldn't overcome, but a decision to simply wait no longer and open fire the moment the ashfall reappeared, record or no record. We're running out of time to have this conversation gently, Tomas said, watching the readout. The custodian's attention, if that was the right word for whatever it did instead of looking, turned toward the sensor feed showing the waiting fleet, and something in the gold light around it hardened. They have been waiting outside my shell to kill you the moment you leave, it said. That is the same failure mode I have watched 4,001 times. I built a place that protects history and does nothing to protect the people who earn the right to carry it. That ends now, if you will allow me one more decision before you go. What happened next did not look, to the ashfall sensors, like an attack. It looked like the hollow sun exhaling. The gold structure of the shell brightened along its entire surface at once, and the custodian's form dissolved back into it, not vanishing but distributing itself, becoming, for a handful of seconds, the entire vast architecture of the star at once. The fusion shell's opening widened, gently, without violence, and through it poured not weapons fire but light. A controlled, directed pulse that swept across the Directorate fleet's forward sensor arrays and comm systems and, as far as the HFY's instruments could tell, did nothing more destructive than overwhelm every scanner and screen on every ship with the same flood of history the custodian had first tried to give the HFY, compressed into a single blinding instant. It was not designed to kill. It was designed, Priya understood as she watched the fleet's weapon systems go dark one by one, to make 4001 deaths, and everything the custodian had learned from them, impossible for the Directorate commanders to ignore or dismiss as legend. A war fleet could not easily justify destroying the one confirmed source, in the entire galaxy, of every extinguished civilization's true history. Not once that history had been placed, unavoidably, inside their own ship's memory banks, tagged with the names of the dead who died trying to steal it. On the HFY's bridge, they watched it happen in real time, the Directorate fleet's tight, disciplined formation fracturing into something closer to confusion. Weapons officers who a moment before had been counting down to a kill order were suddenly staring at screens filled with the funeral rites of a species that had died 1,000 years before their own homeworld had developed writing. Command channels, which the HFY's intercepts had been quietly monitoring the entire time, dissolved into the particular chaos of people trying to issue orders while half their crew sat frozen at their stations, overwhelmed by grief that wasn't theirs and couldn't be unfelt. "That's not going to make them our friends," Tomas said, watching the fleet's formation break further apart. "No," Priya agreed, "but it's going to make them think twice before they open fire on the only known source of it. You can replace a warship. You can't replace the only surviving record of 100 dead civilizations, and now every officer on that fleet knows exactly what they'd be destroying if they pulled the trigger." The Directorate fleet held position. It did not fire. Eventually, with the particular slowness of an armed force that has just been handed a problem too large for its rules of engagement, it began to withdraw. "They will return, likely with more ships and less patience," the custodian said, its form settling back into something closer to individual shape as the light along the shell dimmed. "I have bought you time. I have not solved the problem of what this place is, or what it means that I have finally opened it to someone." "Then don't solve it alone," Priya said. "You said you wanted to stop being the only one who remembers. So don't be. Come with us." "I have never left this shell," the custodian said, and for the first time in 11 hours, it sounded uncertain rather than simply old. "I do not know what I would be outside of it." "Neither do we most days," Tomas said. "Nobody knows what they'll be outside the thing they've been trapped inside until they actually leave it. You've had 4,000 years to guess. Maybe it's time to just find out." The custodian was silent for a long moment, gold light moving slowly along the great curved shell around them like something considering, for the first time in longer than it could measure, a future it hadn't already decided. "The record cannot leave the shell entirely," it said finally. "It is too vast and too fragile outside this structure to move all at once. But I can. And I can carry with me what matters most. Enough of it to matter, enough of it to be worth protecting, and enough of it to make certain no one who comes after mistakes this place for a vault again. It is, I think, exactly the kind of decision I was afraid to make alone. I would rather not make it alone any longer." The HFY left the Hollow Sun 3 days later, its hull patched with materials the custodian had shown Tomas how to grow rather than weld, its engines running cleaner than they had in months on principles that hadn't existed in human engineering a week earlier. It carried, in a containment space Tomas had built specifically for the purpose, a fragment of the custodian's own substance. Enough, the being had explained, to think and remember and choose, though not enough to be the whole of what it had been. The rest remained behind, folded back into the shell, waiting, tended now not by a single exhausted guardian but by a standing invitation the custodian had built into the star before they left. Any who came asking honest questions, rather than assuming answers, would be heard. Somewhere behind them, the hollow sun kept burning, exactly the way a star was supposed to burn, giving nothing away to anyone who didn't know to look. For 1001 wrecks still drifted inside it, a graveyard the custodian had chosen, finally, to stop adding to. On the bridge, Naya watched the star shrink behind them on the aft display, its false red glow settling back into the ordinary dark of deep space. "So what do we tell people?" she asked. "The Directorate's going to talk. Everyone's going to know we found something out there." Priya thought about it for a while before she answered, one hand resting on the small containment housing where the last piece of a 4,000-year vigil now rode quietly beside her crew, no longer alone with what it carried. We tell them the truth, she said. That the galaxy's darkest secret wasn't a weapon, and it wasn't a treasure. It was just someone who'd been guarding something so long they forgot they were allowed to ask for help. Behind her, faint and warm, something like a voice that had learned to speak again after 4,000 years of silence said, quietly, that it thought that was exactly right. Tomas ran one last diagnostic on the reactor before he let himself sleep, out of habit more than necessity, and found himself smiling at the readouts for the first time in longer than he could remember. The engine was running clean. The hull was holding. Somewhere in the ship's growing systems, threaded quietly through circuitry that hadn't existed a week earlier, something old and patient and no longer alone was resting too. You did good today, he said aloud, to no one in particular, and was mildly startled when the small containment housing beside the engineering console answered him anyway, in a voice grown warmer already than it had been 11 hours ago inside the shell. So did you, it said. All of you. I had 4,001 chances to learn that, and I needed a 4,002nd before it finally landed. I intend to be more careful with what I've been given this time. Tomas didn't have a clever answer for that, so he didn't try to find one. He just nodded, checked the last readout, and let the ship carry them on. The ashfall pushed on into the dark, carrying more than it had ever carried before, and for the first time in a long while, none of its crew were running from anything behind them. They were simply, finally, going somewhere.